On the 9th of June 2026, inside a Collin County courtroom in McKinney, Texas, 12 jurors returned to their seats, and a single word was read aloud that would bring an entire nation to a standstill. Guilty. That one word closed 14 months of arguments, protests, legal maneuvering, national headlines, and two families enduring a kind of pain that most human beings will never be asked to carry. 14 months of a case that had fractured communities, ignited social media, drawn white nationalist demonstrators to a high school stadium, prompted an FBI investigation into fabricated evidence, and placed the American justice system under a microscope so intense that the glare reached every corner of this country. And when the sentencing phase concluded, Karmelo Anthony, 19 years old, was given 35 years in a Texas state prison. His attorneys immediately filed a notice of appeal. He was transferred out of Collin County and into the state's broader prison system. And the family of Austin Metcalf, who had waded through all of it, sat in that courtroom and tried to absorb what accountability actually feels like when the person you lost can never come home. This is a case that demands to be told in full, not in fragments, not in viral clips, not through the distortion of online outrage or political convenience. In full, from the beginning, with the facts laid out clearly, the people treated as human beings, and the truth given the respect it deserves. So today, that is exactly what we are going to do. We are going to go back to the very beginning. We are going to talk about who these two young men were before any of this happened. We are going to walk through every documented moment of what unfolded on the morning of the 2nd of April, 2025. We are going to examine what the evidence revealed, how the trial was constructed and contested, and what the verdict means for everyone still living inside this story. If you are new to this channel, welcome to Beyond the Verdict. This is what we do here. We take real cases, real people, and real facts, and we break them down with the seriousness and the care they deserve. No speculation, no sensationalism. Just the truth, documented and delivered clearly. If that is the kind of content that matters to you, take 10 seconds right now and hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are looking for exactly this kind of storytelling. Now let us get into it. Before we talk about a stabbing, before we talk about a courtroom, before we talk about a verdict, we need to talk about two young men who were alive and building their futures in the same suburban Texas city, attending different schools, running on different tracks, and living parallel lives that had absolutely no intersection until the morning everything changed. I want to be deliberate about this because, in cases that generate the kind of national attention this one did, the temptation to reduce people to their roles in a single event is almost overwhelming. The victim becomes a symbol, the accused becomes a monster, and when that happens, the truth gets buried under the weight of narrative convenience. That does not serve the families, it does not serve the public, and it does not serve the honest pursuit of understanding what actually happened and why. So let us start with Austin. Austin Matthew Metcalf was born on the 31st of July, 2007. He was a junior at Memorial High School in Frisco, Texas, a rapidly growing suburban community that sits within the broader Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. Frisco had transformed over the previous 2 decades from a relatively modest town into one of the fastest-growing cities in the entire country, drawing families from across the nation who were looking for exactly the kind of environment that seemed to promise strong schools, athletic opportunity, and upward mobility. Austin Metcalf was the product of that environment in every meaningful sense. He was not simply an athlete who happened to keep his grades up. He was genuinely excellent at both, and the people around him recognized it. Austin carried a 3.97 grade point average. That is not a rounding error. That is a student who took his academic life as seriously as his athletic one, who understood that what happened in the classroom mattered just as much as what happened on the field. And on the field, Austin was something special. He was the MVP linebacker on Memorial High School's varsity football team. But here is what makes that distinction particularly meaningful. That recognition was not handed to him by a coach or an administrator. It was voted on by his own teammates and his coaching staff, the people who practiced with him every day, who watched him in the film room, who lined up beside him in the rain and the heat. Those people looked at Austin Metcalf and said, "You are the one." That kind of peer recognition tells you something about a person's character that statistics simply cannot capture. Austin was also a competitor on the track and field team, working to develop his speed and his explosiveness. Football was his primary identity as an athlete, but he approached track with the same discipline he brought to everything else. He was not just going through the motions to stay in shape during the off-season. He was genuinely committed to becoming faster, more complete, more capable. That commitment was visible to anyone paying attention. And then there was Hunter. Hunter Metcalf arrived 2 minutes after Austin, and from that moment forward, the two of them were inseparable. They played on the same football team, they trained together, they competed on the same track squad. They shared the experience of growing up side by side in a way that only twins truly understand. A bond constructed not just from family but from shared heartbeats, shared memories, shared ambition, and a connection that ran so deep it was almost impossible to describe from the outside looking in. If you saw Austin, Hunter was never far away. That was simply how they lived. Austin's mother, Metcalf, described her son publicly using two words that I keep returning to. She called him a peacemaker and a protector. Think about what those words actually mean. Not an aggressor, not someone who sought conflict or escalated tension. A peacemaker, someone who moved toward resolution rather than confrontation. A protector, someone who placed himself between the people he cared about and whatever was threatening them. That was how his own mother, the person who knew him better than anyone alive, chose to describe her son. His father, Jeff Metcalf, was deeply invested in his sons' lives. The three of them, Jeff, Austin, and Hunter, had gone hunting together just days before April 2nd. It was something they loved doing as a family, a ritual that connected them, a shared experience that pulled them away from everything else and placed them together in the quiet of the outdoors. Jeff Metcalf would later say publicly that he felt fortunate to have spent that final weekend with his son. He did not know at the time that it would be the last one they would ever have together. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old with everything ahead of him. College scouts were paying attention to his football ability. He was building a future, one practice, one game, one race at a time. He had a twin brother who ran beside him. He had parents who believed in him completely. He had a classroom record that opened doors. He had a life that was fully, genuinely in motion. And on a Tuesday morning in April, it ended. Now let us talk about Karmelo. Karmelo Sincere Anthony was born on the 10th of May 2007 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He was the oldest of 4 children in a family that would eventually make a decision that reshaped all of their lives. His mother, Karmelo Anthony, described the family's move from Louisiana to North Texas as a deliberate, intentional choice. She said publicly that 3 years before the incident, her family came to North Texas searching for a better life, a stronger foundation, a fresh start in a place that offered more than what they had left behind. They settled in Frisco, the same city where Austin Metcalf lived, the same sprawling suburb that had drawn families from across the country with the promise of opportunity. Karmelo attended Centennial High School, and he distinguished himself almost immediately after arriving. He maintained a 3.7 grade point average, a reflection of genuine academic engagement in a school environment that was new to him and his family. He was the captain of the football team, a running back with real ability who had earned the respect of his teammates through consistent effort and visible talent. He also competed on the track team, running the 100-meter and the 400-meter at genuinely competitive times. The colleges had taken notice. Texas Lutheran University, McMurray College, and Centenary College of Louisiana had all extended interest in Karmelo Anthony. These were institutions saying clearly and directly, "We see something in you that we want to be part of our program." For a kid who had relocated from Louisiana and built his athletic reputation from scratch in a new state, that kind of recognition carried real weight. Beyond athletics, Karmelo was working. He held 2 part-time jobs simultaneously, one at Foot Locker and one at H-E-B, the Texas supermarket chain. That is not a small thing for a high school student managing a 3.7 gigapascals, captaining a football team, competing in track, and navigating college interest. That kind of work ethic speaks to a young man who understood that the future he wanted required effort that went beyond what school and sports alone could provide. He was on pace to graduate the following month. His father, Drew Anthony, was his loudest and most visible supporter. Drew worked as a general sales manager at a car dealership, and he never missed an opportunity to celebrate his son publicly. He posted about Karmelo's athletic achievements on social media, sharing touchdowns and personal bests with the unrestrained pride of a father who believed deeply in what his son was building. For Karmelo's birthday, Drew surprised him with a Lexus IS 250. That single detail communicates something important about the investment this family had made in their son, not just financially, but emotionally. This was a household built around believing in Karmelo completely. Athletics ran deep in the Anthony family bloodline. Karmelo's uncle, Andre Anthony, was the head football coach at Bonnabelle High School in Louisiana. The sport was not just something the family enjoyed. It was woven into who they were. And by every documented measure available before the 2nd of April 2025, Karmelo Anthony had no criminal record of any kind. Not a single prior incident with law enforcement. Not one. A clean slate. A young man who, to every external observer, was doing everything right. Here is the detail that I think gets buried beneath everything else that followed. Austin Metcalf and Karmelo Anthony had never met before the morning of the 2nd of April 2025. Not once. Different schools. different social circles, no shared history, no prior conflict, no rivalry, no bad blood of any kind. They were strangers living in the same city, competing in the same sport, carrying the same kind of futures on their shoulders, and they had never crossed paths until the morning one of them died. Two families who had poured everything into their children. Two young men who had built genuine, promising lives for themselves. Two teenagers with futures that were real and visible and within reach. And by the time that Tuesday morning was over, one of them was dead, and the other's future had been permanently and irrevocably destroyed. The 2nd of April, 2025, Frisco, Texas, Kuykendall Stadium. The event was a UIL District 11-6A track and field championship meet, one of the most significant competitions of the high school track season in the region. Multiple schools from the Frisco area were represented. Athletes were warming up on the infield. Coaches were organizing events and confirming heat assignments. Parents and spectators filled the stands. It was the kind of day that student athletes spend months preparing for. The day where the training either shows up or it does not. The day that separates preparation from potential. The atmosphere inside that stadium in the early hours of that morning was exactly what you would expect from a high-stakes high school competition. There was energy. There was focus. There was the particular kind of controlled intensity that surrounds young athletes who have been working toward a single moment for an entire season. And then the weather changed. Thunderstorms moved into the area. Heavy rain began to fall across Frisco. The meet was delayed. Competition came to a halt. And when a track meet gets delayed by weather, there is an immediate and predictable response. Athletes, coaches, athletic trainers, and support staff all scramble for shelter under whatever cover is available. In the world of high school track and field, that cover is almost always your team tent. This is a point I need to explain carefully and completely because it becomes the foundation of everything that followed. At a track and field competition at every level, from middle school regional meets to major invitational events, each school establishes its own designated team tent before the competition begins. That tent is not just a rain shelter, it is the team's operational base. Gear is stored inside it. Athletes rest and recover under it between events. Coaches coordinate strategy from it. It is, functionally, the team's home territory at the meet. A track coach from Memorial High School described this publicly in clear terms. A tent at a meet marks your spot. It is the equivalent of a team bench. You simply do not enter another school's tent uninvited. That is a boundary understood at every level of the sport, by athletes, by coaches, and by anyone who has spent meaningful time around track and field competition. Memorial High School, Austin Metcalf School, had their team tent set up in the bleacher area of Kuykendall Stadium. When the rain came and the delay was called, athletes from Memorial gathered under their tent as any team would. And during that delay, Karmelo Anthony, a student from Centennial High School, not Memorial, entered that tent and sat down. People noticed immediately. Multiple students recognized that Karmelo did not belong there. Multiple students told him he needed to leave. This was not a single polite request that got lost in the noise and confusion. According to testimony that would later be presented in open court, Karmelo Anthony was asked to leave that tent approximately 15 times. 15 separate requests from multiple students who understood what the tent represented and who recognized that his presence there was a violation of an understood boundary. Hunter Metcalf, Austin's twin brother, was among those who spoke to Karmelo directly. Hunter told him clearly that this was Memorial's tent and that he needed to go. Karmelo did not move. I want you to hold that sequence carefully because this is the moment where the entire legal argument that would later unfold in a Collin County courtroom takes its root. The witnesses who eventually testified at trial did not describe a young man who had wandered into the wrong area by mistake, who had misread the situation and was trying to correct it when approached. They described someone who had been asked to leave 15 times and had refused every single request. Someone who, according to multiple independent accounts, was not passive in that tent, but active, not retreating but holding ground. Austin Metcalf stepped into the confrontation. Words were exchanged. The argument escalated rapidly, the way confrontations between teenage boys can when adrenaline and pride and the pressure of an audience combine into something that moves faster than reason. The verbal exchange intensified. The tension in that tent climbed towards something that multiple witnesses could feel coming but could not stop. And at some point during that escalation, Karmelo Anthony reached into a bag, and he spoke 4 words that would be repeated in that courtroom more times than any other phrase in the entire trial. Touch me and see what happens. 4 words, documented in the initial police report, recalled by multiple witnesses, returned to repeatedly by prosecutors throughout the case. 4 words that the prosecution would argue to the jury were not the language of fear, were not the words of someone trying to de-escalate a situation they had not initiated, were not the communication of a person looking for a way out. They were, as prosecutors framed it, a direct threat, an explicit invitation to physical confrontation, the language of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. One witness who took the stand at trial testified to something that carries significant weight in understanding the dynamic inside that tent. That witness recalled Austin Metcalf responding to the escalating situation by stating plainly that he was not going to fight. Process that for a moment. While one party was reaching into a bag and issuing verbal threats, the other was verbally declining to engage physically. One person was escalating. The other was trying to draw a line under the conflict before it crossed into something physical. Austin Metcalf then pushed Karmelo Anthony. Witness accounts differed slightly on the exact nature of that physical contact. Some described a two-handed push that resembled the kind of block a football lineman would deliver. Others characterized it as a smaller, single-handed shove. The accounts were not identical on this specific detail, but what came next was not disputed by any party in the entire case. Karmelo Anthony pulled out a pocket knife and stabbed Austin Metcalf in the left side of his chest. It was approximately 10 o'clock in the morning. Dozens of students were within direct eyeshot of what happened. The entire sequence, from the initial verbal confrontation to the moment of the stabbing, lasted by witness estimates somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes. Collin County Medical Examiner Dr. Elizabeth Ventura would later testify about what that knife did when it made contact. The blade perforated Austin Metcalf's right ventricle. The wound measured 2.5 inches in length. Dr. Ventura's professional assessment, delivered under oath before 12 jurors, was direct and unambiguous. The wound was not survivable. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old. He died that day over a refusal to leave a tent that was never his to occupy. The chaos that erupted in the seconds and minutes immediately after the stabbing was immediate and overwhelming. Witnesses described students frozen in place, unable to process what they had just watched unfold in front of them. Some were crying. Some were standing completely still, caught between the instinct to run and the incomprehension of what they had just seen. A football coach rushed to Austin and applied pressure to the wound, trying to slow something that could not be slowed. Memorial's athletic trainer began CPR and continued performing it until paramedics arrived on scene. Despite those desperate and sustained efforts, Austin could not be saved. He was transported to an area hospital where he was ultimately pronounced dead. Hunter Metcalf had been there for all of it. He had personally told Karmelo to leave. He had watched his brother step into the confrontation. He had watched his brother fall. Jeff Metcalf later shared publicly what Hunter told him afterward. Hunter said he tried to hold the wound shut with his hands to stop the blood from leaving his brother's body. But there was too much. Austin Metcalf died in his twin brother's arms at a high school track meet on a Tuesday morning in April. That is a level of grief and trauma that does not resolve. It does not heal cleanly. It does not arrive at a moment where it is over. It simply becomes something a family carries forward into every morning that follows, permanently and without relief. According to witness testimony presented at trial, Karmelo Anthony jogged away from the tent after the stabbing. A coach who encountered him on the track in the immediate aftermath testified that Karmelo told him directly, "He put his hands on me, I stabbed him." When law enforcement arrived and placed him into custody, Karmelo raised his hands and stated, "I was protecting myself." He then asked the arresting officers a question that would become one of the most discussed and debated details of the entire case. He asked, "Is he going to be okay?" The pocket knife used in the stabbing was recovered from the bleachers at the scene. This case did not remain local for long. It went national within hours, and almost immediately it became about far more than what had happened beneath that tent in Frisco, Texas. Karmelo Anthony is black. Austin Metcalf was white. And in 2025, in the United States of America, that reality became an immediate and unavoidable part of the public conversation surrounding the case. Before a single piece of evidence had been formally examined, before any witness had given any statement in any official proceeding, before any legal argument had been constructed or contested, people across the country had already chosen their positions. The case had been absorbed into a cultural and political framework that was operating entirely independently of the actual facts on the ground. Two distinct and simultaneous national conversations emerged, and both of them were happening at full volume. On one side, there were people who looked at this case and saw a young black man who would inevitably be treated inequitably by a criminal justice system with a long and well-documented history of racial disparity. They raised what were, in many instances, entirely legitimate questions about whether Texas self-defense laws would be applied with the same standard they would be applied if the racial composition of the situation were reversed. Those concerns did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from a documented historical reality that has shaped American criminal justice for generations, and to dismiss those concerns entirely would require a deliberate ignorance of that history. On the other side, there were people who looked at the documented facts as they understood them and concluded that the situation was legally and morally straightforward. A 17-year-old boy had been stabbed and killed. Another young man had done it and had admitted to it. Accountability was required. The law existed for exactly this kind of situation, and the law needed to function. Both of those conversations were happening simultaneously, on social media, on cable news, in living rooms, in churches, in schools, and in communities across the country. And neither one of them was fully divorced from legitimate concern. But both of them were also, at various moments, being weaponized in ways that had very little to do with Austin Metcalf, Karmelo Anthony, or the truth of what had happened inside that stadium. On the 19th of April 2025, a group identifying itself with white nationalist ideology held a demonstration at Kuykendall Stadium, the exact location where Austin Metcalf had died. That tells you everything you need to know about how far this case had traveled from its origins. Two 17-year-old boys at a track meet had become a flashpoint for ideological forces that had been looking for exactly this kind of moment, and those forces had found their way to a high school stadium in suburban Texas. Shortly after Austin's death, dangerous misinformation began spreading across social media platforms. A social media account impersonated the Frisco chief of police and circulated what was presented as an official autopsy report. That document was entirely fabricated. It was false. It spread anyway, reaching millions of views before the Frisco Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation both launched formal investigations into the source of the disinformation campaign. The fact that a fabricated autopsy report could accumulate millions of views in a matter of hours before any official correction could catch up to it tells you something critical about the information environment in which this case was playing out. Through all of it, Austin's father, Jeff Metcalf, stated his position publicly and maintained it consistently. He said this was not about race. He said this was not about politics. He called it, in his own words, a human being thing. Collin County District Attorney Bill Werski echoed that position from the prosecutorial side, stating publicly that the case had nothing to do with race. Those statements came from the people closest to the actual center of this tragedy, and they deserve to be heard clearly and reported accurately. I want to be careful and direct about something here, because I think it matters to say it plainly. It is entirely possible to acknowledge the full weight of the racial and political context that surrounded this case, to recognize the legitimate historical concerns about equal application of the law, to understand why so many people saw this through a wider lens, while also staying grounded in what the legal process was actually required to do. The criminal trial of Karmelo Anthony was not designed to resolve the entirety of America's complicated relationship with race and criminal justice. It was designed to examine specific facts about a specific event, apply specific legal standards, and arrive at a verdict. That is what happened. And the family of Austin Metcalf, who had buried their son and sat through 14 months of everything that followed, deserved a trial built on exactly that foundation. When jury selection began on the 1st of June 2026, the Collin County Courthouse in McKinney, Texas was operating under heavy security protocols. The jury pool for this case included nearly 600 people, a number that reflects the extraordinary difficulty of finding 12 individuals in that county who could honestly claim they had not been exposed to significant pretrial publicity about the case. Lines of spectators formed outside the courthouse each day, hoping for seats in the public gallery. Supporters of Karmelo Anthony gathered in the Texas heat outside, holding signs and demonstrating their belief in his innocence. The national media was present in force. This was not a local trial anymore. It had become a national event being staged in a Collin County courtroom. Judge John Roach Jr. presided over the proceedings. The prosecution was led by First Assistant District Attorney Bill Werski. In presenting their case to the jury, prosecutors described the stabbing as a provoked and unjustified attack. They used the phrase sneak attack in their arguments, a characterization that carried obvious weight in the framing of Karmelo's state of mind at the moment of the stabbing. The prosecution's strategy was built around several interconnected pillars. First, the sequence of events inside the tent, the refusals to leave, the escalating confrontation, the verbal threat. Second, the 4 words that Karmelo had spoken before the push: touch me and see what happens. Third, and perhaps most powerfully in practical terms, the consistency of the student witnesses. Multiple young people who had been present at Kuykendall Stadium on April 2nd took the stand during the trial. They had witnessed the confrontation from its beginning. They had watched the escalation unfold. They had seen what happened, and when they testified, their accounts aligned. They told the same story in their own individual words, without coordination, without rehearsal, without the kind of alignment that only appears when testimony has been manufactured. Independent witnesses telling a consistent narrative is one of the most compelling forms of evidence a jury can hear, because the alternative explanation, that multiple unrelated people independently decided to fabricate the same account, requires a level of conspiratorial thinking that most juries are not prepared to accept without extraordinary countervailing evidence. The prosecution understood this, and they built toward it deliberately. The defense countered by constructing an argument rooted in physical reality and the legal doctrine of self-defense. They emphasized the size differential between the two teenagers, noting that Austin Metcalf outweighed Karmelo Anthony by 50 to 60 pounds. They pointed out that Karmelo was seated when the physical contact occurred, placing him in a position of immediate physical disadvantage when a larger person made contact with him. They argued that in that split second, in that chaotic and rapidly escalating moment, Karmelo Anthony acted out of genuine fear for his physical safety. They asked the jury to step into his position, to see that moment not from the calm retrospective distance of a courtroom, but from the compressed and terrifying immediacy of the moment itself. They presented self-defense as the legally appropriate framework for understanding what he did. The defense also asked the jury to consider the argument of sudden passion, a lesser legal standard that would have resulted in a significantly reduced sentence if accepted. The jury was being given multiple options for how to process what they had heard. They deliberated for approximately 3 hours. 3 hours to examine 14 months of evidence, testimony, argument, and legal instruction. 3 hours to weigh everything the prosecution had presented against everything the defense had offered. 3 hours to evaluate the credibility of witnesses, the significance of forensic evidence, the weight of documented statements, and the legal framework that governed their decision. When they returned, their decision was unanimous. All 12 jurors had reached the same conclusion. All 12 rejected the self-defense claim. All 12 rejected the argument of sudden passion. The verdict was first-degree murder. The sentencing phase followed, and when it concluded, Karmelo Anthony, who had been 19 years old on the day of the verdict, was sentenced to 35 years in a Texas state prison. His attorneys filed a notice of appeal. He was transferred out of Collin County and into the broader Texas state prison system. And in a house somewhere in Frisco, Texas, a family that had gone hunting together just days before the 2nd of April 2025, a father and a surviving twin, and a mother who had described her son as a peacemaker and a protector, sat with a verdict that told them the legal system had heard them. And they sat with the understanding that no verdict, no matter how it is worded, and no sentence, no matter how long, returns what was taken from them on a Tuesday morning at a track meet. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old. He had a 3.97 grade point average and a football future, and a twin brother who arrived 2 minutes after him and trained beside him every day of their athletic lives. He had parents who loved him. He had a future that was fully, genuinely, actively in front of him, and he never left that stadium. This is a case that carries questions that extend far beyond the verdict itself. The appeal that has been filed means this legal story is not finished. The broader conversations about self-defense law, about racial equity in the justice system, about how rapidly misinformation can consume a real tragedy and reshape public understanding of it, those conversations are not finished either. The families at the center of this case are still living it every single day. In the second part of this breakdown, we are going to go deeper. We are going to examine exactly what happened inside that courtroom during the trial, the specific testimony that shaped the jury's thinking, the legal arguments that the defense built and the prosecution dismantled, the medical evidence that Dr. Ventura placed before those 12 jurors, and what the notice of appeal actually means for Karmelo Anthony's future. We are going to look at what his legal team is arguing, what grounds they have identified for challenging the conviction, and what the realistic possibilities are for the years ahead. We are also going to talk about what this case means in a broader sense, not as a political symbol, not as a racial flashpoint, but as a real human story with real human consequences that will follow everyone connected to it for the rest of their lives. Before we get there, if you have been watching this and you are not yet subscribed to Beyond the Verdict, this is the moment. Hit that subscribe button right now. Every single week on this channel, we break down real cases with the depth and the seriousness they deserve. Real facts, real people, real storytelling. Drop a like on this video while you are at it. It takes less than a second, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of careful, grounded true crime content is worth putting in front of more people. Every like and every subscription genuinely matters for what we are building here. The verdict in the Karmelo Anthony case was handed down on the 9th of June 2026. The appeal has been filed. The legal process continues. And the story of what happened on the 2nd of April 2025, inside a stadium in Frisco, Texas, is far from finished being told. When multiple witnesses who did not know each other, who had no opportunity to coordinate their recollections, and who had no shared incentive to align their stories all described the same sequence of events in the same order with the same critical details. Something important happens inside a courtroom. The defense can no longer argue that one person is mistaken. They can no longer suggest that one witness carries a hidden motive to deceive. When the number of independent voices telling the same story reaches a certain point, the only available counterargument becomes that all of them are wrong simultaneously. And that is an extraordinarily difficult position to sustain before 12 people who have been asked to evaluate credibility for a living, at least temporarily. That was the wall that the defense team of Karmelo Anthony ran into during the trial that concluded on the 9th of June 2026. And understanding exactly how and why that wall proved insurmountable requires us to go back inside that Collin County courtroom and walk through everything that happened, from the opening arguments to the moment the verdict was read out loud. That is what this second part is going to do. We are going to examine the legal arguments on both sides with the seriousness they deserve. We are going to walk through the testimony, the evidence, the closing arguments, and the deliberation. We are going to talk about what the conviction means in practical and legal terms for Karmelo Anthony's future. We are going to talk about the appeal that has been filed and what it realistically represents. And we are going to talk about the human reality that sits beneath all of it: 2 families, 1 verdict, and a loss that no legal outcome will ever fully address. Let us start with the legal architecture of this case, because understanding the verdict requires understanding what the law actually asked those 12 jurors to decide. Texas has among the strongest self-defense protections of any state in the country. That is not an opinion or an exaggeration. It is a straightforward legal reality. Under Texas law, a person is not required to wait until physical force has already been used against them before responding in self-defense. The statute recognizes that if you reasonably believe force is about to be used against you, you have the right to act before that force lands. You do not have to absorb the first blow. You do not have to wait until the danger has already materialized. The law acknowledges that in real confrontations, in real moments of genuine threat, reasonable people sometimes have to make rapid decisions under pressure, and it extends legal protection to those decisions when they meet the required standard. Defense attorney Mike Howard made this point directly and accurately to the jury. Texas law does not require that you wait until you get hit. That is a truthful statement of how the statute reads, and Howard built his entire theory from that foundation. His argument went like this: in the moments inside that tent, with the confrontation escalating rapidly, with Austin Metcalf physically larger than his client by 50 to 60 pounds, and with physical contact already having been made in the form of a push, Karmelo Anthony genuinely and reasonably believed he was in danger. The push was real. Multiple witnesses confirmed it. No one disputed that it happened. Howard positioned that physical contact as the triggering event, arguing that Karmelo's response, however devastating and permanent in its consequences, was a direct reaction to being physically struck by a larger opponent in an already volatile situation. He asked the jury to consider what that imbalance meant to a 17-year-old boy who was seated when the contact occurred. Sitting down, facing someone who outweighed him by 50 to 60 pounds, in the middle of a confrontation that had been building for several minutes. Howard asked those 12 jurors to step out of the calm, air-conditioned distance of a deliberation room and place themselves inside the compressed and terrifying immediacy of that moment. He asked them to evaluate Karmelo's state of mind, not from the retrospective clarity of a courtroom, but from the fractured and accelerating reality of a confrontation that was moving faster than rational thought. On paper, that is a coherent legal argument. It engages the statute honestly. It draws on documented physical facts. It asks the jury to apply a subjective standard to a genuinely chaotic moment. And in a different factual landscape, with a different evidentiary record, it might have been enough to create the reasonable doubt the defense needed. But this was not a different factual landscape. Here is where the defense encountered a problem that no amount of legal skill could fully navigate around. The witnesses. Not one witness, not 2. Multiple independent student witnesses who had been present at Kuykendall Stadium on the morning of the 2nd of April 2025, who had watched the confrontation unfold from its beginning, and who had no opportunity, no incentive, and no apparent reason to coordinate their accounts before they took the stand more than a year later. Every single one of them described Karmelo Anthony as the person driving the confrontation forward. Every single one described him refusing to leave the Memorial High School tent after being asked, repeatedly, to do so. Every single one recalled the verbal threat, "Touch me and see what happens." And critically, multiple witnesses described Karmelo reaching into his bag before the push ever occurred. Before any physical contact was made between the 2 teenagers, before Austin Metcalf's hands moved toward him, Karmelo was already reaching for something. That sequence matters enormously in any self-defense analysis, and it matters specifically under Texas law, because self-defense is a reactive legal doctrine. It is constructed on the principle of responding to a threat that someone else has placed upon you. The law protects the person who is reacting to danger initiated by another party. What the witnesses described in that courtroom was not a reaction. What they described, consistently and independently, was preparation. A person who issues a verbal challenge, then reaches into a bag, is not preparing to flee the situation. He is preparing for physical confrontation. And that framing, established not by prosecutors through argument, but by multiple eyewitnesses through sworn testimony, cut directly and deeply into the foundation of Howard's entire theory. One student witness went further than simply describing the sequence. That witness testified directly that he did not believe the stabbing constituted self-defense, characterizing it in his own words as lethal force used in response to non-lethal force. That is a significant statement from a peer who was standing close enough to watch everything happen, a young person with no legal training who had nonetheless arrived independently at the precise legal and moral distinction the prosecution was asking the jury to apply. The prosecution's central legal argument was built on the principle of proportionality. Prosecutor Bill Wersky made this point to the jury with the kind of directness that closing arguments in a murder trial demand. You do not get to meet a shove with a stab, especially when you are the person who created the conditions that produced that shove in the first place. The right to self-defense in Texas is real, but it is not unlimited, and it is not available to everyone in every circumstance. If you are the person who provoked the confrontation, if you created the dangerous situation, if you escalated at every opportunity rather than retreating when retreat was available, your ability to claim the legal protection of self-defense becomes significantly harder to sustain. The jury was being asked to evaluate whether Karmelo Anthony had forfeited that protection through his own conduct before the push ever occurred. Wersky walked the jury through the prosecution's framework methodically. Karmelo Anthony chose to enter a tent that did not belong to him. He was asked to leave and he refused. He was asked again and he refused again. That pattern repeated across approximately 15 separate requests from multiple different people. He issued a verbal threat. He reached into a bag. And when Austin Metcalf physically responded to that escalating threat with a push, Karmelo reached for a blade. The prosecution's thesis was direct. Karmelo Anthony did not stumble into a dangerous situation. He constructed one, step by deliberate step, and then used the physical response that his own behavior had provoked as the justification for a lethal act. The jury agreed. There is one more element of the trial that deserves honest examination, and it involves a decision that every criminal defendant has the absolute constitutional right to make. Karmelo Anthony did not testify in his own defense. That is his right. The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution protects every defendant from being compelled to take the stand, and that protection is among the most fundamental in the American legal system. Judge John Roach Jr. instructed the jury precisely and correctly. They were not permitted to draw any negative inference from the defendant's decision not to testify. Silence is not evidence of guilt. The instruction was legally sound and appropriately delivered. But juries are not composed of legal abstractions. They are composed of human beings. 12 people sitting in a room trying to understand the internal experience of another person during a moment of acute crisis. And when the central question before them is, what was actually going through that person's mind, what he genuinely feared, what he genuinely believed in those seconds inside that tent, and that person never speaks to them directly, a gap exists. Not a legal gap, not an evidentiary gap, a human one. The jury heard from nearly every other person who was present at Kuykendall Stadium that morning. Teenagers who had competed there, coaches who had responded to the scene, law enforcement officers who had processed the evidence, the medical examiner who had examined what the knife did to Austin Metcalf's body. The one voice they never heard was Karmelo Anthony's. In theory, the self-defense argument had legitimate legal grounding. It engaged the statute honestly, drew on documented physical facts, and asked the jury to apply a subjective standard of fear in a chaotic moment. In practice, when placed against a wall of consistent, independent eyewitness testimony, against a documented verbal threat captured in a police report, against medical evidence that described a wound measuring 2.5 inches that perforated Austin Metcalf's right ventricle, and against a jury that returned its verdict in less than 3 hours, the argument did not survive. Now let us walk through the full arc of what unfolded inside that courtroom from the first day to the last. Jury selection began on the 1st of June 2026, 14 months after Austin Metcalf died at Kuykendall Stadium. The pool numbered nearly 600 people, a figure that reflects the extraordinary difficulty of seating 12 impartial jurors in a case that had generated the volume of pretrial publicity this one had. The selection process was thorough, careful, and observed closely by both legal teams and the national media organizations that had followed every development in the case since the spring of the previous year. From the very first morning of proceedings, the atmosphere outside the Collin County Courthouse was unlike anything the community had experienced in recent memory. Lines formed before the doors opened each day, filled with spectators hoping to secure one of the limited seats available in the public gallery. Media organizations had established their positions outside the building. Security throughout the entire proceeding was heavy and visible. This was not a local trial happening quietly in a regional courthouse. It was a nationally watched event being conducted inside a formal court of law, and everyone present understood that distinction. Inside that courtroom, Judge John Roach Jr. made his expectations clear from the very beginning of the proceedings. He ran a controlled environment and returned repeatedly to the reminder that the room was a court of law governed by evidence and procedure, not a forum for public sentiment or emotional demonstration. He issued that reminder more than once before the trial reached its conclusion. The testimony stretched across nearly a week, and one of the most striking aspects of the witness list was how many of those called to testify were themselves teenagers. Young people who had simply shown up at a high school track meet to compete, to cheer, to support their teammates, and who instead found themselves standing inside a formal courtroom more than a year later, raising their right hands and swearing to tell the truth about what they had watched happen in front of them. That is not an ordinary thing to ask of a young person. These were students who carried the memory of watching a peer die at a school event, a memory that had not faded in the 14 months between the morning of April 2nd and the day they took the stand. They sat before a judge, a jury, 2 legal teams, cameras, and a packed public gallery, and they told their stories with clarity and composure. The consistency across those independent accounts was, by any legal standard, significant. When students who had no opportunity to coordinate their recollections describe the same sequence of events in the same order with the same critical details, it creates a level of evidentiary weight that is genuinely difficult for a defense team to dismantle. You cannot argue convincingly that one teenager is misremembering when the same essential account is being delivered by multiple teenagers who did not speak to one another about their recollections before testifying. You cannot suggest one witness carries a motive to lie when that motive would have to extend simultaneously to an entire group of unconnected young people. The only available counterargument becomes that all of them are wrong simultaneously, and as that number grows, that position becomes progressively harder to sustain before 12 people tasked with evaluating credibility and truth. Coaches testified about what they had observed and about what occurred in the immediate aftermath of the stabbing. Law enforcement officers who had responded to the scene and who had processed and secured the physical evidence took the stand and described their findings and their actions. Medical testimony from the Collin County medical examiner established the nature of the wound and the cause of death with clinical precision. The knife had perforated Austin Metcalf's right ventricle. The wound measured 2.5 inches in length. The injury was, in Dr. Elizabeth Ventura's professional assessment, not survivable. Those words, delivered under oath by a forensic medical professional, carried a weight in that courtroom that required no additional emphasis. Throughout every day of the proceedings, Austin Metcalf's parents were present in that courtroom. They sat and they listened and they watched as the evidence establishing that their son's killing was not legally justified was laid out before the jury with methodical clarity. Hunter Metcalf, Austin's twin brother, who had reportedly not attended earlier proceedings in the case, made his first appearance in that courtroom on the day the verdict was delivered. He came for the moment that mattered most. Karmelo Anthony sat at the defense table throughout the proceedings. His parents, Drew and Kalahis Anthony, were present in that room as well, carrying the full and visible weight of everything their family had endured across the 14 months since April of the previous year. 2 families sitting on opposite sides of the same room, each carrying a grief that looked entirely different from the outside but that shared the same essential quality: the knowledge that nothing that happened inside that courtroom would restore what had been lost. Closing arguments arrived, and both sides made their final appeals to those 12 jurors with everything they had. Prosecutor Bill Wersky was direct and unsparing. He told the jury plainly that this was not self-defense. He walked methodically through the evidence one more time, reminding the jury of the sequence step by deliberate step. Karmelo Anthony chose to enter that tent. He was asked to leave and he refused, repeatedly. He escalated the confrontation verbally. He issued a direct threat. He reached into a bag before any physical contact was made. And when Austin Metcalf physically responded to that escalating threat, Karmelo made a choice to reach for a blade. Worski asked the jury directly what kind of community they wanted to live in, framing the case in terms of accountability and in terms of what it means for a public school event. A place where families bring their children to compete, to become the site of a fatal stabbing without legal consequence. His closing did not rely on emotion alone. It returned to the evidence, and it stayed there. Mike Howard gave his final argument for the defense and made his most personal and sustained appeal to the jury. He asked those 12 people to place themselves in the position of a 17-year-old boy in the middle of a rapidly deteriorating physical confrontation. He reminded them of the legal standard that applied under Texas law. He returned to the push as the pivotal moment, arguing that in the split second when physical contact was made, in the chaos of that moment, Karmelo Anthony acted out of genuine and reasonable fear for his physical safety. Howard made a real and earnest argument on behalf of his client. He constructed the best case available from the facts he had. He did the work that the moment required of him. And then the jury went to deliberate. Outside the courthouse, supporters of Karmelo Anthony stood in the Texas heat and waited. Inside that building, in separate spaces charged with different kinds of tension, 2 families sat with their grief and their uncertainty, while 12 people went into a closed room to determine what justice required of them. They were back in under 3 hours. Experienced observers of criminal trials understand what a rapid verdict in a murder case typically communicates. Juries that spend days deliberating are usually working through genuine uncertainty, weighing competing arguments against each other, sitting with reasonable doubt that has not fully resolved. A jury that returns a verdict in a first-degree murder case in less than 3 hours has, in most observed instances, found its conclusion without significant internal conflict. That speed communicated something before a single word was spoken aloud in that courtroom. Judge John Roach Jr. called the room to order. He reminded everyone present that whatever the verdict contained, composure and control would be maintained inside that courtroom. And then the word was read. Guilty. Unanimous. All 12 jurors. First-degree murder. The self-defense claim had been rejected in its entirety. The sudden passion argument, which, if accepted, would have reduced the severity of the charge and the potential sentence significantly, had also been rejected. The jury had heard every hour of testimony, examined the physical evidence, evaluated the credibility of witnesses, and concluded beyond a reasonable doubt that what happened inside that tent at Kuykendall Stadium on the morning of the 2nd of April 2025 was not lawful self-defense. It was murder. The reaction inside that courtroom was immediate and visceral and entirely human. From one side of the gallery came sounds of grief and shock that did not require description to understand. Karmelo Anthony wept. The sound of a mother absorbing the conviction of her child is one of the most painful things a room can hold, and that room held it. Karmelo's defense attorney moved close to him as the verdict settled over the table. On the other side of that courtroom, Austin Metcalf's parents received the word that the legal system had found accountability for their son's death. Hunter Metcalf, sitting in that room for the first time, leaned forward as the verdict was read. He had come to hear that single word, and he heard it. Outside, among those who had been waiting in the Texas heat for the news, the verdict reached them within moments. Now let us talk about what this conviction actually means in practical and legal terms, because the details here are specific, and they are not always clearly explained in the broader public conversation about the case. Karmelo Anthony was 17 years old when Austin Metcalf was stabbed at Kuykendall Stadium. Texas law permitted prosecutors to try him as an adult, and he was convicted as an adult. That adult conviction follows him permanently. It affects his right to vote. It impacts his ability to pursue a wide range of professional opportunities. It shapes his legal identity in every meaningful sense for the remainder of his life. An adult first-degree murder conviction is not a record that can be expunged or sealed. It is permanent. However, because he was a juvenile at the time the offense was committed, federal constitutional protections apply that place specific limits on what sentence he can receive. The United States Supreme Court has ruled in cases including Graham versus Florida and Miller versus Alabama that sentencing a juvenile offender to death or to life without the possibility of parole is unconstitutional. Regardless of the severity of a sentence given to someone who was a juvenile at the time of the offense, a legal path to parole consideration must exist. That constitutional protection applied here. The sentencing phase began almost immediately after the guilty verdict was returned. The defense called a single witness during sentencing. Karmelo Anthony, Karmelo's mother, took the stand within minutes of her son's conviction. She did what any mother in that position would do. She spoke for her child. She told the jury that she knows her son is sorry for what happened. She told them she still has love for him. She told them that whatever the outcome of this proceeding, he would remain her son. Prosecutors responded with a single question. They asked whether, regardless of what happened in that courtroom, Karmelo would still be part of her life. She said yes. That answer, placed against the unspoken and permanent reality that Austin Metcalf would never again be part of anything in his family's life, landed in that courtroom with a force that needed no amplification. The jury heard the contrast without it needing to be stated explicitly. They understood what was sitting on either side of that single exchange. After weighing the aggravating factors of the offense against the mitigating circumstances of Karmelo's age and his documented lack of any prior criminal record, the jury sentenced him to 35 years in a Texas state prison. Under Texas parole guidelines for a first-degree murder conviction, he must typically serve at least half of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole consideration. That calculation places his earliest possible parole eligibility at approximately 17.5 years from the date of sentencing, meaning he would be somewhere in his mid-30s before a parole board would even begin to evaluate his case. And parole eligibility is not parole granted. Those are two entirely different things, and the distance between them is significant. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles reviews each case individually and on its own merits. They examine the conduct and behavior of the incarcerated person throughout the entire period of incarceration. They evaluate participation in rehabilitation and educational programming. They consider the specific circumstances of the original offense. And critically, they hear directly from the victim's family. Every time Karmelo Anthony's name comes before that board, Austin Metcalf's parents and Hunter Metcalf will have the right to speak. Their words will carry documented weight in that room. The voice of that family does not end with the verdict. It continues for as long as the parole process does. There has been considerable public discussion about the possibility of a gubernatorial pardon, and the legal and political reality of that path deserves to be described accurately. A pardon in Texas requires the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles to first make a formal recommendation, after which the governor must agree and sign. In a case defined by consistent and independent eyewitness testimony, a documented verbal threat captured in an initial police report, a unanimous jury verdict returned in under 3 hours by 12 people who heard every piece of evidence, and the level of national scrutiny this case attracted across more than a year of public attention, a pardon represents an extraordinarily remote possibility. It is not technically impossible under Texas law as a procedural matter, but as a realistic and viable path to freedom under the present facts and the present political environment. It does not represent a credible scenario. The appeal is a different matter, and it deserves to be treated as such. Karmelo Anthony's defense team has filed a formal notice of intent to appeal the conviction, and that process is legitimate and grounded in the legal system's own structure. Defense attorneys in a case of this magnitude and this level of public attention will examine every ruling made by the court during the trial. They will scrutinize every instruction given to the jury regarding the application of self-defense law under the Texas statute. They will review every evidentiary decision made by the judge throughout the proceedings. They will identify every moment where they believe the trial court may have erred in a way that affected the outcome. Appeals in first-degree murder cases move slowly through the system. They take years. The process is deliberate by design, and they rarely succeed in overturning a conviction supported by the volume and consistency of evidence that was presented in this trial. But the defense has both the legal right and the professional obligation to pursue every available avenue on behalf of their client. And this case will remain inside the legal system for years to come, regardless of the finality that the June 9th verdict appeared to represent. So here is where we arrive. At the end of this story, or at least at the end of this chapter of it, Karmelo Anthony, who was born on the 10th of May 2007, who grew up as the oldest of 4 children in a family that relocated from Louisiana to North Texas in search of a better life, who captained a football team and earned genuine athletic recognition from college programs, who worked 2 part-time jobs while maintaining a 3.7 grade point average, who had no criminal record and no prior contact with law enforcement of any kind, is now a convicted murderer. He is 19 years old. He is facing 35 years in a Texas state prison. He will not be considered for parole before he is well into his 30s, and that consideration carries no guarantee of release. Austin Metcalf, who was 17 years old, who shared every meaningful memory of his athletic life with his twin brother, who arrived in the world 2 minutes after him, who carried a 3.97 grade point average, who was voted team MVP by the teammates who trained and competed beside him every day, who was described by his own mother as a peacemaker and a protector, will never run another race. He will never play another down of football. His parents will never watch him compete again. They will never see him graduate. They will never meet the person he was becoming. Hunter Metcalf, who held his brother in the final moments of his life on the bleachers of a high school stadium, who tried with his own hands to stop the blood from leaving his brother's body, walked across a graduation stage, and accepted 2 diplomas, his own and his brother's. The crowd rose and gave him a standing ovation. And in that single image, in the sight of one twin accepting the diploma of the other in a gymnasium full of people who understood exactly what they were witnessing, the full and unmediated weight of this loss became visible in a way that no courtroom testimony and no legal document could fully capture. 2 families, destroyed by a rain delay, a team tent, and a pocket knife that had no place being anywhere near a high school track meet. There are no clean answers in a case like this. There is no resolution that repairs what was broken. There is no verdict, no sentence, no legal outcome that restores what was taken on the 2nd of April 2025. What there is, as of the 9th of June 2026, is a judgment. A unanimous judgment from 12 jurors who heard every piece of evidence, sat through every hour of testimony, listened to every argument from both sides, and returned with one word in under 3 hours: guilty. That word does not bring Austin Metcalf back. It does not give Hunter his brother back. It does not reach inside the Metcalf household or the Anthony household and remove the grief that lives there permanently. What it does is mark the conclusion of what the legal system was asked to determine, and it will stand as the answer to the central question this case placed before the courts of Collin County, Texas, and before the watching nation beyond them. The story of Austin Metcalf and Karmelo Anthony is, in every meaningful sense, a story about the space between a provocation and a decision. About the seconds that permanently divide the person you were from the person you become. About 2 families whose lives collided in a stadium on a rainy April morning and were shattered in the time it takes to reach into a bag and make a choice that cannot be unmade. About what a push costs and what a blade takes and what a verdict changes and what it never can. That is the full documented story of this case. From the 2nd of April 2025 to the 9th of June 2026. Every fact grounded in the evidentiary record, every legal consequence laid out as clearly and as honestly as the documented truth allows. Austin Metcalf was 17 years old. He deserved more mornings. He deserved more races. He deserved the future. His mother watched him build, and his father watched him earn, and his brother ran beside him toward. He deserved to go home from that track meet. If this breakdown gave you something of value, if you believe that the people at the center of cases like this one deserve to have their stories told with accuracy and with genuine respect for everyone involved, then take one moment right now and show this channel that it matters to you. Hit the like button on this video. Subscribe to Beyond the Verdict if you have not already done so. Every subscriber, every like, every share helps this channel continue doing exactly this kind of work. Responsible, grounded, factually accurate storytelling about real cases involving real people and real consequences. These families are real, these losses are real, and they deserve better than noise. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. Beyond the Verdict, real cases, real consequences, real truth.